They pardoned this guy. They knew what he was up to. They ruined your life. Your parents died and you weren't allowed to have a funeral. Your children weren't allowed to have prom. They weren't allowed to have a graduation. And meanwhile, they pardoned this guy because they knew that he was lying the whole time. So let's jump in. I think the story, if I had to guess, that most normies in a legal perspective are interested in today, in the past week or so, would be Dr. Fauci. I think that COVID was a huge deal to people, that in many ways, a lot of these political stories we talk to, there's like degrees of separation between how a story, like for example, we might think birthright citizenship was a huge deal, and it was. That case was a huge deal. But when you talk to your neighbor that's like, I can't afford groceries, there's degrees of separation from that court decision and what affects them every day. COVID was different. COVID was the government, like politics, in your face to everyone in this country. The decisions that were being made directly affected each and every person in different ways around the country. And I think a lot of people are outraged is what they see with Fauci. Of course, his diary came out. It makes him look like a megalomaniac. It shows that they were half-assing it, just flying by the seat of their pants. He was getting contradictory information about where the virus came from, what would be effective in private. He was admitting in private in his diary that the vaccine wouldn't give you immunity. He comes across as someone who's a narcissist, who's more concerned about his own image and how famous he's becoming rather than the horrible situation that's going on, largely because of the policies he's pushing. But he was given immunity. Then he testifies in front of the committee there.
Well, he was pardoned, which is more or less.
Oh, yeah. Yes, my bad. He testifies in front of Rand Paul's committee and basically takes the fifth 111 times. So I think the base level question that most people have, including myself legally, is he in legal trouble? Is there A, could the pardon go away? Or B, some people are suggesting perhaps he could be charged with contempt because you can't plead the fifth if you're pardoned. What do you think on the possible legal jeopardy in any of those scenarios with Fauci?
So there's a few layers to this. The first is he was given a pardon. It's a fairly blanket pardon. It basically says, from 2014 to 2025, or sorry, I gave the date slightly off, I think, but for a 10-year period, any crimes that could have occurred that were arising from or related to his service. And arising from or related to is legalese for maximum breadth, right? It doesn't even have to be something that is directly like something that you did in your job. It just has to be related to your job. It's the biggest, widest, most broad possible language for that sort of thing. So it's very difficult to see how he would not have an active pardon that prevents him from having criminal liability for anything that he did during that time period on a federal level. On a state level, the president cannot pardon state crimes. And Florida and Louisiana and Alabama are all currently investigating him. So it is possible, if they can come up with a legal theory on a state level, that he would have some kind of prosecution related to the work he did when he was in office. But on the federal level, there's basically no chance of that happening. I know that there's some people in the, law tube spheres. I know Following Pro and I are cool. He's a nice guy. He has kind of a very novel theory about how maybe you could get around the pardon in this case. I'd call that a true legal Hail Mary. You're talking about a 98, 99% to 1. The odds that this Supreme Court would undo a presidential pardon are approach zero. They're very serious about executive power, and they're not going to chop into the executive power in that way. So I think that's basically a non-starter. Contempt is trickier.
I'd like to take a moment to thank today's sponsor, Proton VPN. My audience knows I'm a huge tech boomer, and so I started using Proton VPN to stop with the constant tracking, and it's been a game changer. Proton VPN hides your IP from websites, advertisers, and the government, so you can access the web without being tracked. Proton VPN has a strict no logs policy that's been verified by independent security audits, and it has unlimited bandwidth even on the free option. Click the link in the description to try Proton VPN 100% free. It helps the show, and more importantly, it empowers you to take control of your internet privacy.
Contempt is trickier. And feel free, I'm monologuing, so feel free to interrupt whenever you want. Contempt is trickier. The argument there is he was called to Congress to testify, and he didn't provide any information. He wouldn't answer any questions. But he took the Fifth Amendment. And the Fifth Amendment means that you cannot be forced to testify if it's going to risk incriminating yourself and exposing you to criminal liability. The argument that people want to make is, well, he can't be exposed to criminal liability because he can't be charged federally. So if someone has immunity, this happens all the time. It actually happened with in the Tyler Robinson case. Lance Twiggs could be forced to testify because he was given immunity. So he can't take the Fifth because he has immunity. The problem here is that Fauci is being investigated by states. So he has a pretty good argument that he can say, well, I'm taking the Fifth because I don't want to give Florida, Louisiana, and Alabama ammunition to come after me in state court. And that is a kind of down the middle winning argument. So I don't think they're going to get him for that. The only thing that I think they might be able to get him for, and I wouldn't call this a good odds, but the only thing is he took the Fifth for questions like, what day of the week is it? He took the Fifth. What color is the carpet? He took the Fifth. Now, there's no realistic probability that answering those questions would in any way, shape, or form expose you to criminal liability. So maybe there they could get a contempt, they could bring a contempt charge, but that seems like a pretty thin branch, and I wouldn't put too much weight on it, to be honest.
So, yeah, going in the order of those three things, I completely agree with the pardon. I think that it's pie in the sky that people think that this pardon from Biden or a litany of other ones that he did on the eve of leaving. And, we know that allegedly there was an auto pen. I think even if that's true, I cannot see the court revoking it. They've historically been pretty lenient when it comes with pardoning, right? Like I'm questioning. I think that probably like someone could stand up and say, I paid Biden to pardon me, and he agreed, and that would stick, right? That's like how complete the pardoning power is. Now, it would hurt you politically, theoretically, but as far as criminally, I don't, or legally, I don't see them revoking it.
Yeah, I mean, as a reminder to the audience, when they decided the presidential immunity decision, and they were defining what a core and exclusive executive power is, one of the examples they gave of the most clear-cut exclusive executive powers that neither Congress nor the court has power to review was the pardon. So the court's already gone on record saying that they're not going to touch this. So it would be shocking if they changed their mind.
And then to further complicate matters, even with any like legal theory that you may come up where he had to officially sign the auto pen doesn't count, I think what you would be likely to see is courts would be sympathetic to the fact that Biden's still alive and would probably be like, no, I'm okay with those pardons. It would be different if Biden was out there like, wait, what? No, I didn't sign off on that. That would be a different story. But seeing as how he's clearly going to take the stance of, no, I was okay with those, I just don't think there's a chance at all that he's charged with anything from his official capacity from 2014 on. So that's out. The contempt, I largely agree with you there. I don't think that there's going to be a contempt charge for the reasons you said. Here's another reason. I don't know if I'm interested to see what you think about this. Can he make the argument? Because just so people know, the Fifth is your Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination legally. If you're given immunity, you can't incriminate yourself legally, right? Now, you already mentioned, but he still could by the state. He's not given immunity there. I think another argument that it would be interesting, it would be if he said, but you're going to challenge the pardon. So let's say that I testify, and I'm like, okay, I'll be completely an open book because I can no longer be charged federally. And then you go to court and rule, actually, Biden's pardon didn't exist. Now I've incriminated myself. And so that's something that Rand Paul and others are talking about. They're going to challenge this pardon. So, I'm going to operate as if I could potentially lose that case and the pardon could go away. And so I'm still allowed to plead the Fifth. And I think for me, not a legal scholar or a lawyer, that's a compelling argument. It's like, if there's even the slightest chance that you think there could be a lawsuit to revoke the pardon, you should be allowed to plead the Fifth to not incriminate yourself.
At the very least, a court would consider well, okay, why don't I just hold this action in abeyance? We'll stay. You want contempt? I'll stay this case, and we'll see how the pardon challenge goes. Now, the pardon challenge is a loser, so it will inevitably lose. But that they can just hold off on it and then say, okay, yeah, if the pardon challenge is successful, then he shouldn't have to testify. And if you win, then we have that situation. And if you lose, then we can revisit it late at that point. But I mean, that's the most I could imagine a court doing. I couldn't imagine them granting contempt, except for maybe those very narrow questions about like, what day of the week is it? That sort of thing. But even there, when someone gets held in contempt, it's typically because they didn't show up at all. Like they just say, I'm not coming to Congress. But he did show up. He did like go through the motions. So that doesn't seem likely to me. Oh, and if you wanted a third reason why it's not going to happen, guess where you have to enforce contempt of Congress?
It would be
the federal district or Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
So if you can imagine bringing that prosecution in that district for this contempt proceeding, I think that's going to be the odds are very low that's a very favorable jurisdiction for Fauci. So I would not think that's a high probability play. Now, Congress is pretty angry, so I think they're going to try. I just don't think their odds I think their odds are fairly remote. They'll try.
I don't mind them trying, right? I don't think they'll be successful. I think that trying, though, has the secondary effect of hopefully keeping this in people's mind politically. Forget about legally, but politically, because I think this is a winning issue of just how authoritarian and smug Fauci was. And it really is a story. There are certain stories that happen that it's easy to connect, like I was saying at the beginning of this segment, with the average person. Me and you might talk about birthright citizenship, or we might talk about like scandals like the Biden laptop. These are oftentimes very difficult. And it isn't even just an argument of like the average person's IQ or intelligence. It's just things that you have to really dive in. And the average 9-to-5 worker isn't going to spend a lot of time looking into legal scholars and birthright citizenship and what was being said in 1850 or Burisma. And they're not going to look in. COVID's easy to understand. It was corrupt. It affected people in negative ways. Fauci, the diary's easy to understand. This is a winning story. And it's not something that I'm suggesting, we should artificially inflate because it's a win for my side. I think it's one of the most egregious acts that I've seen in my life, with the violation of people's rights, the treating people like pariahs, the sort of worshiping of Fauci and the science, the media going along with it, the Democrats going along with it. And for me, it's a huge warning sign to like tyranny that we see in books like Brave New World or 1984. So I think that anything they could do to keep this story in the public eye, even if that means pushing for legal measures that they have a very small chance of winning, I still think is worthwhile. And you could easily parlay a loss to this into a blame of the Democrats. Look, they pardoned this guy. They knew what he was up to. They ruined your fucking life. Your parents died and you weren't allowed to have a funeral. Your children weren't allowed to have prom. They weren't allowed to have a graduation. And meanwhile, they pardoned this guy because they fucking knew that he was lying the whole time, right? And so now we can't hold him legally accountable. That's who the Democrats are. So I hope, even though I think it is incredibly bleak that there will be legal consequences. The only potential legal consequence I could see is if Fauci ends up opening his mouth in official proceeding and lies, which I think it's evident he's just going to plead the fifth to everything at this point. Or if he speaks publicly, I don't know, maybe you could speak to this. There was an argument that was being made about James Comey, potentially in Florida, about the furtherance of concealing a crime. And so the statute of limitations, they would say, sort of runs out if you continue to conceal the crime in the future. So, for example, if he would go on MSNBC and say, no one ever deleted material. We didn't violate, FISA request intentionally, anything like that. And you could prove he's lying. Even though it's not a crime to lie to the media, there could be some artful way that they're like, this is him continuing to further a crime with other people who did hide this information from sort of FARA request. What do I keep saying? FISA request. So maybe there's a potential there.
Yeah,
but that would be a long shot.
It's a long shot. Yeah, because it's continuing a crime that would have occurred during the pardon window. So even on its own face, the logic is tenuous. You could maybe get artful about it and give it a shot, but I would call that I think it's a low probability event, but I do think, your read on the politics is right, because I think you and I both have this experience where if you're talking to a lay person or somebody who doesn't watch streams like ours all the time, explaining to them the real risks of court packing and the real tyrannical ramifications of the policies that people are throwing around there is actually kind of tricky. Like you need to have their attention for 5 or 10 minutes to kind of give them the pitch. Whereas if you go back and you say, like, remember when you weren't allowed to go outside? Remember when you had to show your private health information to buy a cup of coffee?
Yep.
Remember that? Remember when that happened? Well, that was what they did the last time they were in office. Well, you think they'd be shy about doing something now? And what, you think that they said it was for an emergency? You think that's going to hold them back? You don't think that they are going to say that Trump's win, Trump's Supreme Court picks, Trump's policies are emergencies that require some kind of drastic measure? This is, it's all just utterances after all. Like, I do think if you can give them the visceral feeling of COVID, and then you say, I'm worried that the left's going to do something overtly tyrannical if they're given power, I think that resonates differently. And that is a powerful political point, even if legally I don't think it's going anywhere.
Wouldn't the Fifth Amendment just be ideological bullshit, according to Fauci? Well, I mean, it's interesting. Not just Fauci, but so many of these people, like, look, people complain about Trump having a few quotes like, whoa, the Constitution doesn't matter. By no means do I think that Trump's someone who's ideologically a constitutionalist. But the left shits on the Constitution all the time. And then, obviously, when it's convenient for them, they're like, whoa, whoa, whoa. So, yeah, I'm sure Fauci, he's the science, so he's above the Constitution.
Well, this is the joke of the whole thing. So one of the things I was doing during this down period politically is I've been deep diving progressivism and trying to refine my arguments and get a bit more poignant in the way I can talk about these things. And the kind of the grandfather of American progressivism, Woodrow Wilson, was famous for saying that we need to progress beyond the values of the Declaration of Independence and a rigid constitution so that we could be administered by experts like Fauci, right? Like, so, I mean, the idea that we should move beyond our traditions and our American values so that the benign, glorious experts can rule us from on high is that's the heart and soul of the progressive movement, always has been. So for them to then later say, oh, well, the right doesn't care about the Constitution is a little bit of a joke. They invented not giving a shit about the Constitution. That was in fact the hallmark of their entire movement. And here we are today, and it's the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, well, here, this dovetails into Lavin, $10, says, unfortunately, all the Fauci stuff is political grandstanding, so the Republicans can have their sound bites and clips for campaign season. Nothing will ever happen to Fauci. Look, yes, and this criticism, I think, is warranted of Republicans 99% of the time. Unfortunately, in this particular case, I don't think you could chalk this up to, like, Republicans dropping the ball, which is why Fauci's going to get away with it. The pardons are pretty Loctite. So in this particular case, all they could do is make political hay. It's different than like with Comey or something like that, or someone maybe Birx or Mayorkas, you could say. They could have went after Mayorkas for legal issues because he didn't receive a pardon. But I don't know. For here, look, I'll be the first to criticize the shit out of Republicans for not actually going after corruption. I find it difficult to complain that, like, well, of course they won't do anything to Fauci. They can't, legally. So
it would be there just is no federally there is no legal remedy. I am not an expert in Florida, Alabama, or Louisiana law. They seem to think they can do something, and they're investigating. I'm skeptical. I'm not sure what jurisdiction Florida has over Fauci for his work in a federal capacity. That seems like a stretch to me, but I don't know. That's not my area. So they could give it a college try, but I wouldn't get your hopes up.
Yeah. Jefferson, on your end, $2 says lockdowns were Japanese internment on steroids. Totally agree.
It was pretty wild. And I really remember, because I was living at the time in Jersey City. I don't anymore, but at the time I was in Jersey City. And Jersey City was like relatively lax compared to New York City. So when I had to go into the city for work, you'd have this experience where to get a cup of coffee, you would have to show a vaccine passport, or you couldn't go inside to buy coffee. And just like, think about that for a second. Like, you weren't allowed in a shop without showing private health data. That's unthinkable.
It was out of control. Like, I could do a 12-hour show easily on just how screwed up everything was, and just most of it just my state of Pennsylvania. There were allegations, for example, initially when they were talking about essential businesses being able to be kept open. I remember in one particular town, a local chocolate store was allowed to remain open. Happened to be a huge donor to the state senator who was a Democrat in that county. So the chocolate store was essential. The hardware store right next to it, not essential. So, heaven forbid you have a plumbing issue. Hey, deal with it. But if you have a late night craving for some semi-sweet chocolate, well, that's essential. The stories are just, I mean, tragic. The stories here are still people, they say 50% of businesses that shut down during COVID will never reopen again. The fraud that went into all the money, the PPP loans, etc., hundreds of billions of dollars of fraud that went out, the inflation that came about as a result of a lot of that we're still trying to dig out of a hole. I said this from the get-go. I said there were three things that were scary about COVID to us. One was the disease itself. I had no idea if it would kill 1,000 people or 1,000,000 people or more. I don't know, but we would be able to overcome that as a country. The second is the measures that we took against COVID, and they were going to be more significant than COVID itself. It was going to crush us economically. It was going to crush mental health for people. It was going to crush physical health for people. And all of that's borne out, and we're still dealing with the consequences. But the third, which we couldn't survive, is if this sets the precedent that we're willing to give up our basic rights anytime there's an unknown disease, that's it. They'll do it over climate change. They'll do it over West Nile. They'll do it over bird flu. It doesn't matter, right? Once they realize that they could decide when to lock you down and when to relieve pressure, that's it. That's the game. And, for me, the sad part was watching so many conservatives go along with it. And to me, that was really, because I expect big government socialists to say, yes, give the government control over when you could leave your house. But watching like small government conservatives be like, well, 15 days to slow the spread. For me, it was the greatest authoritarian experiment I've ever seen. And to this day, I worked in healthcare with people with autism. Their lives were irreparably damaged. People I worked with whose parents was the most important things in their lives. These autistic people, that parents died alone in homes for 2 years while they weren't able to visit. It's just insanity. And it really, for me, I was a little more animated today in the extravaganza talking about it. It's a bit of a different show. But for me, when people say, why do you still focus on this? Why are you angry about it? My question is, why aren't you? If that's not enough to fire you up about the dangers of authoritarianism and just trusting blindly in the government and giving them censorship power and the power to lock you down, nothing ever will be. And so,
it was actually a big part of the reason, not the only part, but a big part of the reason I decided to start doing, speaking publicly about stuff. Because, I could have been happily doing legal work and, making a very good living and not talking about any of this stuff. But around that time during the Biden administration, I had shifted from being a Democrat to being a centrist, if you were going to call it an independent or whatever you call it. And then the vaccine mandate came out. And my gut reaction was like, over my dead body. Like, what right-leaning legal action group do I need to join to combat the idea that the president can sign a piece of paper and make 100 million Americans make a health decision on the basis of his inherent authority, executive? It was such an enormous overreach that I felt like I needed, as like an attorney who could very easily have not been put my hat in the public arena with all the downsides that come with that. I felt like I had to say something about it because it was so far beyond the pale. And then to dovetail back to the court packing issue, to eventually realize that the court as presently constituted with Justice Gorsuch and his major questions doctrine would actually protect us from that sort of thing. That there was actually a functioning branch of government that was going to protect us from that type of overreach, and that they immediately got a target on their back. And here we are, They're trying to undo the one branch of government that saved us from that particular tyranny. So yeah, I mean, this is an issue I care deeply about, and I think most people care deeply about. I know I've heard you talk about it. I remember I asked Jake Rattlesnake about it. He was like, he said the same thing. He absolutely would not be in media were it not for COVID.
They had COVID camps in Australia. I remember watching media in Australia where they're like, the camps aren't that bad. Let's take you through a tour. They literally imprisoned people. Like, just because they didn't want to take an experimental medication. And not only did they get away with it legally, but largely they've gotten away with it politically and culturally, where there hasn't been consequences. And it's one of the most frustrating things. All of the people that sort of went on board with this, they just act like it never happened. It's a long time. The same people that will scream to you about January 6th being like this seminal moment or, other shit, they'll be like, they act like COVID. That was a long time ago. They act like it was in the 1800s. It's like, no, that was you people. People embrace this. The people you voted for. And not only have you gotten away with it culturally, now you want more power. You want to pack the courts. You want more power to be like, yeah, fuck it. And it doesn't, it's worse. The charitable viewing of it is they did all this shit just guessing. I don't know, maybe. But when you read Fauci's diary, and if you just a little bit read between the lines, they knew that a lot of this was bullshit. It was control. It's intoxicating to have total control over a people. How convenient. In the name of health, public health, they were like, well, the federal government needs to pressure social media to censor even true information about vaccines and stuff. It's all in the name of public health. And oh, by the way, while we're at it, let's also censor questions about the 2020 election. Like that's what this bore out. One of the largest transfers of wealth. Like I said, small businesses shut down. Everything about this just unbelievable. And to live through it, and I mean, it's astonishing to me of all the things I've lived through. Their news cycle so fast, like assassination attempt against Trump. 2 weeks later, it's out of the news. Jimmy Kimmel's the victim, or with the Charlie Kirk assassination. But COVID's the one thing where I'm like, I can't believe people moved on. I can't believe that people just are willing to be like, and I get it. There's not going to be legal consequences, but my goodness, if that didn't show you where we're heading quickly as a country, I don't think anything will wake people up. So,
well, the other thing it did is it kind of exposed the underbelly of how progressivism has captured certain institutions in the country, right? Where I remember the teachers unions in particular. I'm a former teacher, so I have I'm somewhat plugged into these areas. But I remember the LA teachers union in particular, the union head, she said basically along the lines of something, the teachers won't, and I think Chicago said the same thing or something similar. The teachers won't come back to work, not just until COVID is fixed, but until we have broader social justice. We have the strike will continue until the city complies with this broad mission of social justice, which has nothing to do with COVID, really. And this is where you see the ugly head rearing, right? Like, there's an emergency. And what does the emergency give? Power. And what do we do with the power? We advance the progressive agenda. And then when we're done advancing it, we're going to call it the status quo. And if you try to go against the status quo, then you're a reactionary, right? Like they're going to roll up the carpet behind them. And, you're far right or extremist or reactionary if you are attempting to undo any of the damage that was done in the name of progress. And by the way, I'm not opposed to progress per se, but there's progress towards the American ideal. And then there's progress towards whatever nonsense justice values they've constructed, which are just the mere policy whims of the day. And they march down these roads, and then we're left wondering what the hell happened a little while later. And they'll look at you like you're crazy when you say, I remember when it didn't used to be this way. You can't memory hold me. You can't gaslight me. I remember that wasn't always like this. You don't call this the status quo and think that I'm insane. I was there. And this is, I find, a very frustrating tendency where every time there's an ounce of power, it just leads to a new rebranding of whatever they've done as the inevitable arc of justice. Whereas I think, you and I look back and we say, God, that was horrifying overreach, not something to be celebrated. Or I think some of them would say, my God, if you ask a progressive, they'd say like, oh my God, then we weren't successful enough with our lockdowns. Yep. Some people weren't complying. We didn't have enough power.
Totally agree.
Next time we need way more power in order to succeed with our agenda in the case of another emergency. And by God, Rob, there'll be another emergency. I guarantee it.
Yep.